The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and crimson, casting long shadows across the arid Texas plains. The wind hissed through brittle prairie grass, whispering secrets only the land remembered. You could smell a storm rolling in from the north, but it wasn't rain that was coming. It was something far worse. Something older than justice. More dangerous than a bandit's bullet. 70 warriors. 70 horses. One lone cabin. And it all began with an old man who thought he'd seen the last of war, of pain, of blood. Jedediah Cole had lived longer than most men dared to dream. Nearing 68 winters, with a thick silver beard and eyes like river stones, he had carved out a quiet life in the wilderness an hour's ride west of San Saba. His land wasn't much to look at, a stretch of dry dirt, a modest log cabin, a chicken coop barely standing, and a hand-built corral where a single old mare gnawed on weeds. But it was his. After 3 decades drifting from war to war, from the border raids of the 1840s to the backwoods skirmishes of the Indian territories, Jed had laid down his Winchester, buried his past, and told the world to go on without him. Solitude was his truest companion. That was until the girl. It was a Tuesday when she stumbled into his life, half-dead and wild-eyed, barefoot, bloodied, and barely 16. She collapsed near his well just after sunrise, skin the color of sun-kissed earth and black hair matted with dust and blood. He thought she was a vision at first, some fever dream born of too much rotgut and not enough sleep. But when he saw the arrow lodged in her thigh, the bite marks along her arms, and the terror in her face when he reached for her, he knew she was real. She didn't speak. Not a word. Not that first day. Jed didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. A wounded Comanche girl out here, alone, bleeding and afraid? That meant trouble. The kind of trouble that came fast and didn't leave survivors. But he couldn't just leave her. Something deep in him stirred, an old feeling he thought had dried up and died long ago. Conscience maybe. Or guilt. He carried her inside, set her on his straw cot and got to work. He cleaned the wound, stitched it shut and wrapped it tight. He gave her water, cooked some cornbread and waited. That night, while the wind howled and coyotes cried in the distance, he sat by the fire with his Winchester across his lap. Just in case. By the second morning, her fever had broken. Her eyes were clearer, and when she looked at him, she didn't flinch. He noticed then just how young she was. No older than his daughter might have been. The one he buried 20 years ago under a cottonwood tree in Arkansas. He offered her food. She ate with both hands as if she'd never see another meal. "You got a name, girl?" he asked. She stared at him for a moment, then touched her chest. Tayome. That was all. Just a name. But it hung heavy in the air. Jed nodded. "Well, Tayome, looks like you ain't dying today." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was understood. Two people who'd lost everything sharing space in a world that had forgotten them. But while Jed was content to let sleeping devils lie, the plains had other plans. The following dawn broke strange. The birds were silent. The wind was still. Even the old mare refused to leave the stable, snorting nervously and pacing in tight, uneasy circles. Jed woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Hooves. Dozens of them. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, heart thundering in his chest like a war drum. What he saw drained the color from his weathered face. 70 Comanche warriors stood silent and still, mounted on painted horses. They formed a circle around his cabin, their bodies painted with ash and blood, their faces solemn and hard. Each carried a lance, a bow, or a rifle. The morning sun gleamed off the beads and feathers tied to their braids. In the center sat a man unlike any Jed had seen, tall, draped in a blanket of eagle feathers, with scars carved into his cheeks like ancient runes. His eyes locked onto Jed's like two blades crossing in silence. Tayome stepped out behind Jed. The old warrior's eyes widened. He raised one hand. The other warriors dismounted as one. Jed felt the air shift, thick like molasses and storm clouds. The man stepped forward. Tayome whispered something under her breath. Jed didn't understand the words, but he understood their weight. Her voice trembled. Her hands clutched Jed's sleeve. "That's your father, ain't it?" Jed said quietly. She nodded. The father spoke, his voice deep and calm but heavy with menace. Jed didn't speak Comanche, but he didn't have to. The message was clear: "You have my daughter. Now tell me why you still draw breath." Jed lowered his rifle just a hair. "She was hurt," he said loud and slow. "She needed help. I gave it. That's all." Tayome stepped forward, said something in their tongue, pointing to her bandaged leg, then to Jed, then to the sky. Her father's jaw tightened. The warriors didn't move. Seconds stretched into minutes. Jed could feel the edge of it all, Death, dancing in the corners of his vision, grinning like an old friend. He wondered if this was how it would end. Not with a sickness or a slow fade, but with 70 arrows in his chest. But then, something unexpected happened. The old chief walked up to Jed, looked him dead in the eye, and extended his hand. Jed, stunned, took it. The warriors bowed their heads. The chief spoke again, shorter this time. Tayome translated, voice soft. He says, "Your spirit is clean. He says you are a man of truth." Jed let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But as he looked around, he realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The old man might have spared him for now, but something darker lurked in those warriors' eyes. Attention. A storm not yet broken. That night, the Comanche camped outside his cabin. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh. They just waited. Tayome barely spoke a word. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Jed sat beside her, turning the words over in his mind. Why had she run? What had she seen? And why, despite the truce, did it still feel like death was coming? The stillness of the camp gnawed at Jed's nerves like termites through pine. Outside his cabin, 70 Comanche warriors sat like shadows cast by a fire that hadn't yet burned. They hadn't moved in hours, but Jed could feel them, breathing, watching, waiting. He didn't sleep that night, only dozed with one eye open and his rifle close at hand. By morning, the wind had picked up again. A dry, searing breeze that tugged at the dust and whispered across the plain like voices long dead. Tayome was already up, squatting by the ashes of the fire pit, her face drawn tight. She looked smaller in the daylight, more like a frightened child than a mysterious survivor. Jed approached her slowly. "He's still out there?" he asked, nodding toward the field. She didn't speak. Just looked at him, eyes rimmed red. "Why'd you run, Tayome?" Silence again. But this time, not empty silence. She was fighting something inside herself. Words that wanted out but were too heavy to carry. Jed sighed and lowered himself onto a log beside her. "I've seen what happens when girls run from their people. Ain't usually a happy story." That seemed to crack her a little. She looked at him, lips parting. "They took me," she whispered. Her voice was brittle like dry leaves underfoot. "Kiowa. Near the river bend." Jed stiffened. The Kiowa were brutal when they wanted to be. Raiding Comanche camps had become more common over the past year, but taking a chief's daughter? That was more than a crime, it was war. "I escaped," she said. 3 days. No food. No sleep. Just ran. Jed rubbed a hand down his weathered face. "Your father thinks the worst, don't he?" Tayome nodded. "He believes I was dishonored." Jed didn't need the full story to understand. Among her people, survival after capture was often worse than death. Honor was everything. If her father believed she'd been defiled, he might see her as tainted. Shameful. And if he thought Jed had taken her for himself? No wonder the warriors hadn't left. He stood up and turned toward the field. The old Comanche chief was still there, standing now at the front of the formation, arms crossed over his chest, unmoving. Jed looked back at Tayome. "I need to talk to him. Alone." She grabbed his hand. "He won't trust your words." Jed gave a grim smile. "I don't need him to trust my words. I need him to trust my life." He stepped off the porch, unarmed, moving slowly toward the gathered warriors. As he approached, several of them shifted, hands near weapons, but the chief raised a hand and the threat passed. Jed stopped 5 feet from him. "Your daughter told me what happened," he said. "I believe her." The chief didn't speak. Jed continued, his voice steady. "I didn't touch her. I didn't take her. All I did was stop her from dying." The chief responded in Comanche, sharp, clipped words like the snap of a branch. Tayome had followed and she translated. "He says, mercy is weakness. That you may have stolen her soul, even if not her body." Jed's jaw clenched. "That girl didn't ask for any of this. She don't deserve to carry that weight." The chief looked at his daughter. There was something deep in his eyes, pain, confusion, maybe even shame. Then he barked something to the warriors. 2 of them rode forward. Tayome stepped in front of Jed. "No." One of the warriors pointed at Jed, then to the field. "They want you to prove your honor," she said. "A test." Jed narrowed his eyes. "What kind of test?" But Tayome didn't answer. An hour later, Jed found himself stripped to the waist, standing in a circle of warriors with nothing but a long hunting knife in his hand. Opposite him stood a younger warrior, bare-chested and tattooed, a scar running from his temple to his collarbone. He spun his own knife in one hand, grinning like a fox in a henhouse. Tayome stood just outside the circle, face pale. "You don't have to do this," she called. Jed didn't answer. He knew better. This was more than a test of strength. It was a ritual, a blood rite. A man did not win such a fight. He endured it. He bled for his honor. He suffered to prove his soul was strong. The chief raised his hand and dropped it. The young warrior lunged. Jed barely sidestepped in time. The knife grazed his ribs, leaving a burning trail. He countered with a swipe of his own, catching the other man's arm and drawing first blood. The warriors around them grunted in approval. The fight continued, brutal and close. There was no finesse, no fancy footwork, just raw instinct, grit, and pain. Jed took a slash to the thigh, a blow to the jaw, and a jab to the shoulder. He gave as good as he got, but it was clear. This boy was faster, younger, and fueled by pride. Jed knew he wouldn't win. But that wasn't the point. Blood poured down his chest, soaking into the dry earth. Still he stood. Still he fought. Until finally, with one last feint and a roll to the side, Jed threw his knife to the ground and spread his arms. The younger warrior froze, panting and confused. Jed looked straight at the chief. "If that don't prove I got no evil in me, then go ahead and finish it." Silence. Then, slowly, the chief walked into the circle. He looked at Jed, at the blood, at the knife in the dirt. He turned to his daughter and spoke. Tayome approached. Her hands trembled. "He says, the land sees truth. The blood speaks. You are a man without lies." Jed collapsed to one knee, exhausted. The chief stepped forward, placed a hand on Jed's shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a mark. A rare, ancient sign of acceptance. But the moment was shattered by the echo of gunfire. A single shot rang out from the trees. One of the warriors cried out and fell. Then a second shot. A third. From the north ridge came a dozen riders. White men in ragged dusters, faces covered with scarves. "Raiders, back," the chief roared in English. "Defensive circle." Jed pushed himself to his feet, vision spinning. He staggered toward his cabin, where his Winchester waited by the door. Tayome followed, grabbing his belt and handing him bullets. "What in God's name are they doing out here?" Jed growled. She was pale. "Kiowa don't ride with white men." Jed stopped, eyes narrowing. "No, they don't." And in that instant he understood. This wasn't just about a girl. This wasn't just vengeance or ritual. Someone had followed her. Someone who wanted more than blood. Someone who wasn't done yet. The world had turned to chaos in seconds. Bullets ripped through the dry morning air as the raiders surged down from the ridge, hooves pounding the ground like war drums. Jed barely had time to slam a shell into the chamber of his Winchester before a round cracked into the side of his cabin, splintering the wood inches from his head. The Comanche warriors responded like a single organism, tightening into a defensive ring around the chief and Tayome. They returned fire with bows and a handful of rifles, holding the attackers at bay. But Jed saw what the raiders had: superior firepower, long-range rifles, revolvers on every hip. These weren't cowhands or desperate outlaws. These men had trained somewhere, fought somewhere. Jed ducked behind a rain barrel, peeking through the cracks in the slats. He counted at least 12 riders, maybe more hidden among the mesquites. One was shouting orders. A tall man in a black duster with a pale beard and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. Something about him was wrong. Too calm. Too certain. He wasn't here to rob or raid. He was here for Tayome. Jed turned to reload when a voice called from behind the smoke. "Send out the girl and we'll leave the rest of you in peace." The Comanche warriors bristled. Tayome froze. Jed stepped out, rifle at his side. "You boys got a death wish if you think you can walk in here and make demands." A burst of laughter came from the ridge. The man in black raised a long rifle and fired once. The bullet struck the ground inches from Jed's boot. "Ain't a demand, old man. Just a promise. Give her up or we take her ourselves." Jed looked at Tayome. Her eyes were locked on the leader, wide with something more than fear. Recognition. "You know him?" Jed asked, voice low. She didn't speak, but her nod was small and trembling. "Who is he?" She swallowed. "He was with them. With the Kiowa. When they kept me." Her voice broke. Jed turned back toward the leader, rage curdling in his chest. This wasn't just some mercenary. This man was a trafficker. A slaver. The kind of monster who wore the skin of civility while peddling nightmares under moonlight. The chief stood beside Jed now, silent but seething. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. They understood each other. Jed spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You ain't getting her. You'll die trying." Silence from the ridge. Then came the scream of a war cry, and the shooting began again. Jed rushed inside the cabin, Tayome close behind. He grabbed 2 extra cartridges, shoved them into his vest, and tossed Tayome a small revolver. "Ever fired one?" he asked. She shook her head. "Now's a good time to learn." Outside, the Comanche had formed a crescent defense around the cabin's north and west flanks. Jed ran to the south window, cracked it just enough to see movement among the trees. One rider was trying to flank the cabin. Jed took aim, held his breath, and squeezed. The man tumbled from the saddle before his body even hit the ground. "Keep their heads down," Jed shouted, moving to the east side. He caught the glint of steel too late. A raider had broken through and charged the rear wall. Jed threw himself sideways as a hatchet buried itself into the doorframe. He crashed into the intruder with all his weight, knocking them both to the floor. They wrestled. Fists, elbows, boots. Jed's shoulders screamed from the earlier knife wound, but adrenaline gave him strength he hadn't felt in 20 years. He got the upper hand, pinned the man, and slammed his skull against the floorboards until he stopped moving. He pushed himself up, chest heaving. Tayome stared from the corner, revolver shaking in her hands. "It's not over," he growled. "Stay ready." Outside, the sounds of the skirmish intensified. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Then the unmistakable sound of someone setting fire, crackling wood, the roar of oxygen feeding flame. Jed smelled it before he saw it. Smoke, thick and bitter. "They're burning the stable," he muttered. "Trying to smoke us out." The chief burst through the doorway, bleeding from his arm, face hard as stone. He spoke quickly to Tayome. She answered, her voice urgent. The chief turned to Jed. "They know she is here. They will burn everything." Jed gritted his teeth. "Then we stop him here." The chief nodded once and returned to the line. Jed turned back to Tayome. "If we're going to survive this, we need to end it fast. That man leading them, he dies, they scatter. You understand?" Tayome's expression changed. She wasn't a frightened girl anymore. She was steel. She nodded. "I will help." Jed led her out the back window. The smoke had grown thick, but it also provided cover. Together, they crawled along the edge of the cabin and out toward the rocks lining the creek bed. From there, they could flank the ridge and catch the enemy leader from behind. As they moved, the sound of battle faded behind them. Time became a strange, stretched thing. Every heartbeat an hour, every step a test of fate. When they reached the ridge, Jed raised his rifle and scanned the trees. There. The man in black. Still on his horse, barking orders, unaware of the 2 shapes crouching just a few yards behind him. Jed lined up the shot. "Let me," Tayome whispered. Jed hesitated, then passed her the rifle. She took a breath, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed down the ridge. The man in black fell backward, his hat tumbling to the dirt. For a second, everything stopped. Then chaos erupted. The raiders panicked, some turning to flee, others firing blindly into the trees. The Comanche saw the shift and surged forward, picking off the retreating men one by one. Within minutes, it was over. Smoke hung heavy over the battleground. Bodies lay twisted across the field, and the fire had blackened half the barn, but it hadn't reached the house. Jed and Tayome returned, weary and silent. The chief stood at the center of the field, looking out over the fallen. He turned to his daughter as they approached. For a long time they stared at one another. Then he stepped forward and placed a hand over her heart. Words weren't needed. Later, as the Comanche gathered their wounded and began preparations to leave, the chief approached Jed. "You fought for her," he said in broken English. "You bled for her. You are not Comanche. But you are not white man either. You are something else." Jed met his eyes. "I'm just a man." The chief nodded. "A good one." Then they left, quiet as ghosts. That night, Jed sat on the porch with Tayome, watching the stars rise over a broken land. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Jed didn't feel alone. He felt like maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for after all. The following weeks passed slow and quiet, but the silence didn't settle Jed's bones the way it used to. There was always a sharp edge to it now, like a blade hidden under wool. He kept his rifle loaded, always within reach, and his eyes drifted to the tree line more than they ever had in years past. The land was calm, yes, but Jed knew calm didn't last in the West. Calm was the stillness before a rattler struck. Tayome stayed. He hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't asked for permission. She just did, the way the river keeps flowing after a storm. Each day, she helped with the animals, gathered water, and tended the wounded barn like it was a holy place. Jed watched her move with a quiet resolve, a strength he couldn't put into words. But he felt it, every time she passed by, every time she smiled without trying to. One afternoon, as they patched a new roof beam together, Tayome finally spoke about the man she'd shot. He used to wear silver rings, she said softly, made from melted coins. He gave one to each girl he took, like he wanted them to remember him. Jed froze mid-hammer. His hands tightened on the wood. You still have one? She shook her head. No. I buried it. Far from here. That silence came again. This time heavy with what went unsaid. Jed didn't ask for more. Some wounds weren't meant for daylight. That night, as they sat under the stars, Tayome asked a question that rattled him more than a firefight. Why didn't you give me up? Jed stared at the fire, flicking a twig into the flame. Didn't seem like the kind of thing a man ought to do. That simple? He looked at her then. Really looked. Yeah, it's always that simple. Either you help someone who needs it or you don't. Rest is just excuses. She nodded, eyes reflecting the firelight. I don't think many would have made the same choice. Jed chuckled dryly. Most folks are good at pretending they're better than they are. Not many prove it when the time comes. She didn't answer, but her fingers drifted toward his, resting gently. He let them stay there. For a time it felt like the worst had passed. But the West has a way of punishing hope. It started with a rider at dusk. A boy barely out of childhood, galloping hard down the trail with panic in his eyes. Jed stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. Help, the boy cried. They're coming. A whole group. They're killing settlers east of the ridge, burning, hanging folks like it's war. Jed's gut twisted. Who? He barked. The boy wheezed, catching his breath. Don't know. They're dressed like soldiers, but they ain't flying no flag. Jed looked toward the mountains. This wasn't coincidence. Something was stirring out there, something meaner and more organized than a few raiders looking to fill their pockets. And the look on Tayome's face told him she'd already guessed what he had. This was connected. Later that night, after the boy had been fed and given a place to sleep, Tayome and Jed sat at the table inside. They're after me, she said. Still. Jed nodded slowly. Because of who your father is? She shook her head. Because of what I saw. Those men, they weren't just Kiowa. Some wore badges. Not real ones. But enough to get them past frontier towns without suspicion. Jed's brow furrowed. Lawmen running with slavers? They're not lawmen anymore, she said. They're ghosts now. Burned out of the army after the war. Hiding behind uniforms, taking what they want. And I saw their faces. Jed cursed under his breath. They won't stop, she continued. Not until I'm buried or silenced. He leaned back, the chair creaking. Then I reckon we'd better make him stop. 2 days later they rode out. Just the two of them. Jed had sent the boy east to warn nearby farms and ask for help. He knew he couldn't trust the townsfolk. Most were too scared to act or too willing to turn a blind eye if it meant keeping their homes safe. No, this was something he had to handle himself. They tracked the raiders' path by the signs they left. Burned wagons, shallow graves, trampled crops. It led them toward a canyon Jed knew well. Narrow walls, only one way in or out. A trap waiting to be sprung. And sure enough they found them there. Camped near the water's edge, too sure of their own power to worry about being followed. Jed and Tayome watched from the ridge above. That's them, she whispered. He's here. The other one. Jed followed her gaze to a tall figure by the fire, silver coins tied to the strap of his rifle. He remembered Tayome's story, each coin taken from the ruin he'd left behind. We can't take him head on, Jed said. Too many. We don't have to, Tayome said. And what she laid out next was brutal, simple, and fitting. That night they moved like ghosts. Jed set fire to the outer tents while Tayome slipped through the shadows and cut the horses loose. Screams echoed as flames licked the sky and beasts panicked. Chaos erupted in minutes. Jed picked off 2 men as they tried to flee the canyon, then ducked back into the rocks. He moved like a wolf, silent, focused. Every shot counted. Tayome held the higher ground, rifle steady, eyes sharp. She didn't miss. By the time the fire died down, only 2 men were left. The tall one with the coin rifle and a wounded straggler crawling through the dust. Jed stepped into the firelight, rifle aimed, and called out. Drop it. The tall man turned slowly. You again? He sneered. Knew you'd come sniffing around. Jed didn't answer. Just stepped forward. Boy, I ought to thank you, the man continued. Your girl's worth a fortune to the right people. Hell, even dead she's. Jed pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the man square in the chest, knocking him back into the fire. He didn't speak after that. Tayome emerged from the shadows a moment later. She didn't look at the body. Just Jed. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm sure." They left the canyon as the first light crept over the hills, smoke curling behind them like the last breath of a dying beast. Neither spoke much on the ride back. There was no victory in what they'd done. No joy. Only quiet. But sometimes quiet was enough. When they returned to Jed's cabin, they found a small bundle waiting on the porch. Wrapped in hide, tied with braided grass. Tayome opened it slowly. Inside was a carved stone, an eagle with outstretched wings. A Comanche blessing. Her father had left it there. A sign. Jed placed a hand on her shoulder. "Looks like the worst's behind us." She looked at him. Or maybe just paused. He smiled. "That's all right. We'll be ready." And in the silence that followed, the world seemed to breathe again. Spring came late that year. Snow clung to the shaded gullies like ghosts too stubborn to pass on, and the wind carried whispers that made even the coyotes uneasy. Jed spent most mornings on the porch, mending tools, watching the horizon like it might betray him. Tayome often joined him, a quiet presence with eyes always scanning the same line. Something had settled between them, unspoken, steady as the land beneath them. They didn't speak of love, not in the way poets or townsfolk did, but in the West, actions always meant more than words. Peace was a rare thing out here. And it never lasted. The first sign came from the river. One morning Jed found hoof prints by the banks, deep ones, unshod, fresh. Whoever rode through hadn't bothered to hide their trail. But that wasn't what chilled his blood. It was the tracks that followed. Bare feet. A child's maybe. And the blood, just a smear like something dragged. He followed it for a mile, shotgun across his back. Found a carcass. Half a deer, half something worse, strung up between two trees like a message. The skin had been removed in strips. Symbols carved into the bark, old and tribal but wrong. Twisted. Jed spat into the dirt. Someone was trying to send a message. He got back to the cabin and told Tayome. She didn't flinch. She looked tired in a way that no sleep could fix. "They're testing us," she said. "Or warning us." That night Tayome spoke of the old ones. Not men, spirits. She called them pahakits. Tricksters. Cursed beings born from hatred and left behind by the tribes who knew better than to speak their names. Some said they wore the skin of men. Others said they were what remained when a soul rotted too long inside a body. Jed didn't believe in ghost stories. Not really. But he'd seen enough of the world to know that evil wore many masks, and not all of them bled when shot. 3 days later, a rider came from the west. He was a preacher once. Jed remembered him from years back. Reverend Weller. His church had burned in a mining accident, and folks said he lost his faith with it. Now his eyes were hollow, his voice cracked like old wood. "They're coming," Weller whispered from the saddle. "Marked in smoke. I saw them. 40 men, maybe more. Riders painted in white ash. No horses. Just walking. Fast." Tayome stepped forward. "Where?" "Between the Devil's Spine and Hollow Rock," he said. "They don't make fires. Don't speak. Just move. Like shadows with bones." Weller wouldn't stay the night. Said it was cursed. Said they'd be dead by dawn if they did. He rode off without another word. Jed and Tayome started preparing. Reinforced the barn. Dug shallow trenches near the tree line. Lit no fires. Told no one. If this was another war coming, they'd meet it with open eyes. 2 nights later, the wind died. No sound. Not even insects. Just stillness. Jed sat with his rifle on the porch, lantern dimmed to a whisper. Tayome was beside him, fingers wrapped around the smooth wood of her revolver. Midnight came and went. Then the howling began. It wasn't wolves. It wasn't anything natural. It came in waves, long, mournful wails that rose and fell like someone crying from inside a cave. Jed's stomach knotted. He stood, scanned the tree line. Saw shapes. Dozens. White figures drifting between the trees. Not running. Just walking. Steady. Pale as death, eyes burning red like coals in a dying fire. "They ain't people," Jed muttered. Tayome whispered, "Pahakits." Jed raised his rifle. "I don't care what name they go by. If they bleed, they die." The creatures came fast. Not sprinting, but drifting with unnatural speed. Jed fired once, caught one in the chest. It crumpled, but no blood came. Just dust. Tayome lit a torch and flung it toward them. The flames licked the dry grass and the creatures recoiled, screeching. No voice, just noise like tearing hide. "They fear fire," Tayome shouted. Jed grabbed an oil can and poured a ring around the cabin. Tayome lit it with a match and the fire raced into the dirt. The light cast long shadows, and the creatures halted just beyond the glow, their eyes watching from the dark. 4 hours they circled, never stepping forward, never speaking, just watching. When dawn finally cracked over the horizon, the figures vanished, gone like mist in sunlight. Jed dropped to his knees. His hands were shaking. Tayome said nothing. She stared at the burned grass, her lips moving in prayer. For the next few days nothing came. No more prints. No more howling. But they both knew it wasn't over. On the 7th day they found a man on the trail. Naked. Skin torn in strips. Still alive. Eyes white, mouth open in a silent scream. Tayome recognized him. He rode with them, she said. The slavers. One of the ones who escaped the canyon. Jed leaned close. The man whispered one word before dying. Forgiveness. That night, Tayome lit a fire and danced. Not the way Jed had seen in tribal celebrations. This was older. Something primal. She burned sage, scattered salt, and sang in a voice that wasn't hers alone. Jed stood at the edge of the light, watching. Listening. And when it was done, she turned to him. They'll come once more, she said. But only once. He didn't ask how she knew. The final night was quiet. Jed oiled his rifle and sat beside Tayome in the middle of the yard. No torches. No fire. Just them. When the first figure appeared on the horizon, Jed stood. Dozens followed. White shapes. Hollow faces. But this time one of them stepped forward. A man. Not Ash. Not Ghost. A real man. Tall, scarred, dressed in black. Jed felt his pulse rise. I know you, he called out. You're the one who ran. The man said nothing. Just lifted his hands and dropped a silver ring into the dirt. Then the rest of the figures turned and vanished into the dark. Just like that, it was over. Jed and Tayome walked to the ring. Picked it up. It wasn't a token. It was an apology. That spring the flowers came early. And for the first time in many years, the wind carried only the sound of birds.